Hi, welcome. My name is Zach Winterfeld, and I'm from Trans Audio Group. And we are here with I would venture to say, world-renowned ATC user, Joe Chiccarelli. He may be rolling his eyes at me, but I definitely consider him to be world-renowned. So I have to admit, Joe, I've known you for maybe 15 plus years. I think I met you as an intern at East West. And
Correct.
so I had to go back and kind of review some of your career. And I got to say, you're even more impressive now that I've learned you don't have a few Grammys, you've got 10, is at least what I read.
Yeah, that's accurate.
And I will say that I've always known you've just had an incredible career and worked with some just amazing artists, from Frank Zappa to Pink Martini, the White Stripes, My Morning Jacket, The Killers, Morrissey, and that's not even remotely close to the list that just keeps on going and going.
Those are a lot of different sounding artists too. You span the gamut there. You've done a lot of different things. I like that.
I try to. I try to not, number one, get pigeonholed, but I also try to really challenge myself and do things differently every time. And I like the challenge. I like, trying things in different genres. And I also like learning from working on different types of artists, because there's certain values and aesthetics that are important to each different genre, and they're different. And you learn a lot. You tend to bring those values into other projects that you work on. So it's healthy. I think it would be a bad thing for me if I were, doing hard rock all the time. I think I might fall into a rut of the same kind of tricks, the same setups and habits. And I fear that it would become a bit of a factory.
A lot of people say that they could mix on anything. And if you learn the speaker, you could mix on anything. With all that different stuff that you do, what role does speakers play in that world? I mean, does the speakers help you see more information, or do they just give you a familiar touchstone?
I think it's a little bit of both, and I do think there's a lot of truth to that. I think you could mix on any speaker once you get used to it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's what you want to hear. It's about detail. It's about phase coherency. It's about ear fatigue. There's a lot of things that come into play. For years I used tannoys. I was a big believer in the SRM, SGM, AMS-10 tannoy. I love those speakers. I found that they made me work hard. They were really accurate. Not the most attractive speaker to listen to. A lot of artists would come in the room and, you kind of know when something sounds good, even when it's not on a speaker that you're warming up to.
Right.
But, and they trusted the fact that I trusted them, but they definitely were not exciting to people. They were not comfortable on the ear. They definitely had a lot of crossover distortion, a bit of a peak in the upper mids, and they took a lot of getting used to. But I worked with them for years because many of the engineers that I had revered, Mick Gosowski and dear buddy Chubba Petos, were using them all the time, and learned that you could really make great records on those. And but, like I said earlier, I really like to change my techniques, change my way of working, change my priorities in working. And so after 10 plus years on those speakers, I was always looking for something else that I could relate to, but would push my mixes in a better place, that I might make bigger sounding records, more dramatic sounding records. I think the Tannoys were great for balance and overall EQ, but I think that maybe as a record maker, I was a little cautious on them. And I was thinking about the first time I heard ATCs, and I think I was working years ago next to James Guthrie, and the engineer, great engineer, worked with Pink Floyd and many other things. And he was using 150s for playback. And I remember thinking that, wow, either this guy is the most amazing engineer in the world, or these speakers are the most amazing speakers in the world. And the truth is, both are true. He's an amazing then and those speakers sounded incredible. And then, this was 20 years ago, perhaps. And then over the years, I got to hear 300s and 50s at Michael Brower's, and got to really appreciate the sound of the speaker. And for my taste, they were always clear, beautiful, really accurate in the mid-range, but maybe in some rooms lacking some low end for my taste. And I'm not one that works with subwoofers. I don't have good luck with subwoofers. I always feel like I get a little hyped in the control room, and I leave part of the record behind when I go to master, that there's not the kind of extended low end that I thought I had. So I tend not to use subwoofers, so I can kind of push more of that stuff into the record. But hearing the ATC 25s, I was just blown away with the mid-range, how I could really accurately hear microphone placement. In fact, I'll recall the story about when I was in Vegas working with Killers and on Ronnie's solo album. You loaned us those 25s, and we were listening to Vocals at the time, and which sounded great in their room. When we brought those 25s in, I was in the middle of guitar overdubs when you brought the speakers in and we put them up on the desk, and we went back to guitar overdubs. And the minute I turned those speakers on and the minute the guitar player started to play, I instantly went, oh my gosh, I have to go out and move that microphone like about a quarter of an inch. And I ran out the studio, moved the microphone, and sure enough, it was a better, tighter, more focused guitar sound. And I didn't hear that on the Vocals. I didn't hear that on the Yamahas or whatever else we had at the studio at the time. So that ATC mid-range has always been the thing for me, how clear and phase coherent it is. So I was attracted to the 25s, but I still wanted a little bit more low end. And when you came out with the 45s, I think it took me all of about 15 minutes listening to them at Sunset Sound here that I was hooked.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Zach.
I was going to say, because I think I remember, if I remember correctly, you actually first heard the 45s at a pre-release launch that we did with some kind of higher end users at the Village.
At the Village.
And I remember you immediately were like, you got to get me these over at Sunset.
No, that's right.
It was like, okay.
Yep.
So it was kind of remarkable how quickly you became a user of a really, really new product for us. I mean, it may not have even been out a month before you made the decision, which is pretty cool, and what an endorsement.
No, it was instantaneous. Definitely love at first sight.
Well, it's a funny thing, because if you talk to Billy Woodman, the guy behind the company and the inventor of that mid-dome, and you ask him, well, if you ask him what his secret is, he says, well, I always think that giving the engineer more information through a better part is the way forward. And of course, it doesn't sound very glamorous to say better parts make better speakers, better drivers make better speakers, but ATC spends an enormous amount of time on fussing over their parts, still hand make them, still do it the same way they were doing it literally 15 years ago. And all that stuff is super important to them, that you get a really good result. And it's great that you talk about mid-range, because that's sort of, it's interesting when I talk to Billy about why the focus on mid-range, and it's really the only thing that translates, right? It's of all the things that matter to people, whatever system they're listening on, mid-range is the thing that defines good sound from bad sound.
Absolutely.
And being a piano player, I think he was especially focused on that, right? And he's talked about that one of the things that pushed him to build his own complete systems was he couldn't find a speaker system that piano sounded good on. So he wanted to develop something, but it's cool that you're able to kind of zero in on the same thing that they were zeroed in on in terms of trying to produce a product. So, so many of these speakers become commodities and people just want to sell stuff.
Yep.
No,
I think that the point is really well taken, that all the information is in the mid-range, and it's crucial that you hear that in the most detail possible. In fact, when I first started going into recording studios, there were always Altec or Uri 604E type of speakers and Oratones sitting on the console. And as you know, those speakers are nothing but mid-range. And the
Right.
sort of theory was that if you get a speaker that just pushes all that mid-range energy out in your face, it'll force you to balance things properly. You'll learn to unmask sounds and make room for sounds. You'll learn balancing and priorities, and you'll start to understand how to get clarity in the mid-range with a speaker that basically has got clear forward mid-range. So unfortunately, neither one of those Uris or Altec 604s or Oratones that are attractive speakers to listen on. And I mean, certainly many classic records were made on them, but they are not the most fun things to listen on. And they are tiring on the ear, like a Yamaha is. And working, long hours for long periods of time on those speakers really takes a toll on you. It's like physically you get beaten down by them. And having something that is clear and present and distortion free makes a big difference to me.
Do you find that the artists you work with have a different feel about the music depending on the speaker they listen to it on?
Absolutely. And like I mentioned earlier, the Tannoy listening experience was great because it was accurate, but it was never really fun for people to listen to. I think the response was, we know this sounds good, we trust you that you're making it sound good, but it's not what we're used to listening to, And I think people wanted a more hi-fi, three-way type of system. So the performers were never ever really excited about listening on them. In fact, I think I told you the Morrissey story. The first time we went to La Fabrique to listen to record, we had the 150s there, as well as 3 or 4 other different types of speakers. And Morrissey himself fell so in love with those 150s that anytime I was listening in the room and had something on the Yamahas or the Oratones or whatever other speaker in the room, he'd just look at me and go, meaning press the button,
on those.
put it on the others, the 150s, because he loved the way he loved to sit in the back of the room on the big easy chair, big comfy chair back there and listen on the 150s, because it Yeah, it sounds like a live band on stage.
The 150s. So go ahead, Zach.
Oh, I really quickly was just going to ask you, you know, you've touched on that you've worked on, you know, let's see, 25s, 45s, 150s. I know just because, you know, we're friends that you've also had to work on 20s, which is a compact two-way.
Yes.
And at home, you've said that, you know, you've got a little hi-fi speaker that ATC makes called the SCM7.
Right?
Yeah. So what is it like for you to go between all of these speakers? I mean, you know, we think we have this really great ATC sound that we carry through the entire line. And so we really work hard to make sure users have the freedom to kind of choose whatever's going to fit the room. But as a user, what is your experience?
I think that's accurate, that there is an ATC sound. It's hi-fi, it's smooth, it's accurate. And I have to say, regarding the 20s and the 11s and some of the other models I've heard that are two-way systems without the mid-range, I was a little curious that to me, the sound of the speaker was that mid-range driver, and not having that, was I gonna be hearing a whole different sound? And it's not the case. And the interesting experience I had with the 20s was when I went up to Montreal to do Broken Social Scene. I couldn't get any ATC 45s up there. Studio Economique didn't have any at the time, so we ended up with a pair of 20s. And I was sort of like, oh boy, what do I trust? I was in a room that I'd never been in. It was a big control room and a big dead control room, as I remember it. I was a little nervous, and but we got the 20s in, and I remember listening to, I carry around a high-res player, basically like an iPod that's 2496. And remember listening to mixes that were my references on the 20s, going, these did sound pretty good. I like these. These are all right. I can relate to these. And we went about making the record and got the best sounds we could, did the best we could at the studio. And I remember bringing the tracks back here to Sunset Sound and went into Studio One, which was my home studio at the time, and heard everything that we'd cut up in Montreal, and the drums and the room sound and everything was so clear and so focused in the mid-range. And I was kind of surprised, because I thought the one area that things might suffer was the mids, that maybe guitars weren't as clear and accurate in the mid-range as I normally could get them. But I don't know. Everything really translated well on those speakers, both when I heard them on my 45s and listening on the main monitors at Sunset. And I was pretty blown away with working on the 20s. The nice things about the 45 for me is that it really can fill the control room. And I think the one thing that's important for me is when a band is out in the room tracking all at once, you have 5 guys out there, they've been listening on headphones for hours. When they come in the control room, they want to be wowed. They want something that feels bigger than life. I mean, they want it accurate, of course, but they really want to be impressed, and they want to feel the music. They don't want to listen on Yamahas or some small speaker that you may find as an engineer is accurate, but that's not what's important to them. They want to just be thrilled with the result. And the thing that the 45s always give me is that sensation of filling the control room and it being a much more visceral experience.
That's cool. That's cool.
That's awesome. So before we let you go,
yeah, no, keep
you know, I think we have to at least a little bit address, you know, the what is happening in the world. You know, so how have you been surviving? And be, what's, I don't want to say life, but what is your professional life like in this new reality, and how have you had to adapt, how you previously worked to now, you know, what you're able to do presently?
Yeah, thank you for asking. All well, everything's okay. Yeah, it's definitely been a challenge. I'm fortunate in that I have my private studio here on the Sunset Sound lot, so I can come in every day and work, and I'm totally isolated. A couple of performers have come in to do vocals and all, but there's enough space here that works out fine. The challenge has been trying to actually track a live band. We were talking earlier, before the pandemic, I was in the middle of doing some tracks with an Australian artist, and he was here. We recorded with a band, and he then had to go back to Australia with the plan of coming back to do more songs. That didn't happen. So we were forced to try and make the remaining tracks work by doing Zoom sessions. And the challenge was quite steep. We had his drummer in Sydney in a studio. Excuse me, we had his drummer in Sydney in a studio. We had myself here in Los Angeles, and we had the artist and an engineer in a studio in Melbourne, and all trying to communicate and make suggestions to the drummer, and, you know, talk about sounds and parts and everything else. And the difficulty, the real challenge for me is the interpersonal relationship. When you're in a room with people and you can talk about stuff, you can give direction, you can bounce ideas off each other, you can try something, and very, very quickly, if it's not working, you go, nah, bad idea, let's move on. It's really hard to do those things over video chats. You find that you have to give people time and space to play out their vision, and if it doesn't work, then you got to backtrack, and people get frustrated. So the process becomes longer than necessary. Some people work great in that environment because they love to have you make a suggestion and then kind of shut the door, dive into their cave, refine it, and come out with something that they're really excited about. But the tricky part has been the communication. So what we would do is that the artist would work on things in Australia. He'd send me files. I would tweak stuff, maybe change some parts around, do some rearranging, if you will, and some tweaking of sounds, send it back to them. They would then do some of their tweaking, send it back to me. In the end, the result turned out great. I think the songs turned out beautiful, but it's definitely a longer, more challenging process. And, you know, I'm always, you want people to be having a great time in the studio, to feel engaged, to feel positive, and not beaten down. And I'm always worried that somebody is just going to get a little frustrated because the communication is not as quick as it could be.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you've you know, dealt with the challenge as best as anybody can, and you know, glad to hear that you're still able to work, since so many industries, it's, you know, can't even do that. So yeah. It's
been a blessing having a private space here. I've always resisted doing it in my home just because I like the experience of kind of going to work and just closing the doors and diving in deep and not being distracted. So this has definitely been a great thing.
So this is Brad Lenny from Trans Audio Group here with Zach Winterfeld and Joe Chiccarelli for ATC. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
You bet.
Pleasure.